Hi, folks. Welcome to this webinar. We're going to allow some time for people to join. I can see them coming in as we speak. So just hang in there and we'll get started in a moment. Good afternoon to everyone who's coming on in. We're just allowing some time for people to join the webinar. Hope you're having a good Wednesday afternoon. We'll get started in just a moment. Hi, folks. Welcome. I can still see that people are joining the webinar. We're just going to hold tight for a minute here to let people come in, and we will get started shortly. Okay, well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a pretty jam-packed schedule today, so I want to make sure we have enough time to get everything in. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kelly Mitchell, and I'm the Executive Director of the Robina Institute of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice. And welcome to our webinar on prison release discretion and prison population size. So at the Robina Institute, our mission is to engage in interdisciplinary education, original research, and policy analysis to achieve transformative change in criminal justice. And it's really hard to believe, but this year marks the 10th anniversary of the founding of the Robina Institute. Today's event is our first in our 10th anniversary series, Creating Transformative Change. We created the series to celebrate the Robina Institute's decade-long commitment to cutting-edge criminal justice research and to explore how this commitment will continue to drive innovation in research, policy, and practice in the years to come. Upcoming events will highlight the Institute's development of unique policy solutions and our commitment to giving voice to people in the criminal justice system. We'll be sharing the details of those events in the weeks and months to come, so please stay tuned for those. Today, we're focusing on the Institute's ability to shine a light on previously unexplored areas. This has been a focus of a lot of our research here at the Robina Institute. For instance, our criminal history enhancement sourcebook offered the first comparison of the ways that states have constructed criminal history scores in sentencing guidelines. And that laid the groundwork for later comparison of the practical effects of those policy decisions. And our Profiles in Parole, Release, and Revocation series provided the first national view into the varying legal frameworks governing parole boards, parole, release, and revocation. And that laid the groundwork for the project that we're focusing on today. The Prison Release Degrees of Indeterminacy Project, which has been generously supported by Arnold Ventures, shines a light on the often ignored role that back-end decision makers such as parole boards and prison officials play in determining the actual time served. Today's presentation features a panel of researchers and practitioners who will review the lessons emerging from the project, along with its potential for system-wide effects. Our panelists include Kevin Reitz, who's one of the founders of the Robina Institute, and who is the James Annenberg LeVay Professor of Law here at the University of Minnesota School of Law. Jennifer Schaefer, Executive Officer of the California Board of Parole Hearings. Julia Laskarensky, Research Scholar for the Robina Institute, and Kristen Hilke, Chair of the Colorado State Board of Parole. Kevin Reitz and Jennifer Schaefer will be speaking first, and then Julia Laskarensky and Kristen Hilke will take the stage. We're gonna save about 10 minutes, maybe 15 if we're lucky, for questions at the end of the session today. So please feel free to submit your questions as we go by using the Q&A feature on your Zoom control panel. So we've shown what it looks like on the desktop, and on mobile, you might have to hover near the bottom of your screen to make it show up. This session is going to be jammed-packed with information and will be, we hope, just the beginning of a conversation about back-end decision-making in the criminal justice system. If you like what you hear, I hope that you'll consider supporting the Robina Institute's work so that we can continue to bring you sessions like these. To do that, you can go to the Institute's website at robinainstitute.umn.edu and use the Give link that's located on our homepage. You can also reach out to us by email at robina@umn.edu. We're also interested in hearing from agencies that are interested in partnering with us for future projects. So reach out if that's your interest as well. For those of you who are in our home state of Minnesota, if you're looking for CLE credits today, the attendance code is 421025. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over now to Kevin Reitz to start us off. Thank you.
Okay, good. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I'm going to see if I can share my screen with everybody. Otherwise, it's going to be a real failure. Let's see. Okay. Hope everyone can see that. This is the project we're talking about, as Kelly said, generously funded by Arnold Ventures. It's really important work, and we're so grateful that they've made it possible. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and all I can give you is some examples from the work of the project, just give you a feel for the kinds of things that we're doing. It's important to know how we define indeterminacy. Indeterminacy to us means unpredictability of actual time served after the judge has imposed a sentence. Now, in the project as a whole, we have quite a few major findings, but among the most important that I'll talk about today is that all American prison systems are indeterminate to some degree. The name of the project is Degrees of Indeterminacy because we don't see it as an all or nothing phenomenon. And one of the things going from state to state that has hit us very hard is that there are vast differences across America in the degrees of indeterminacy found in individual sentences and in entire sentencing systems. There are also vast differences in how decision-making power is distributed at the back end of prison sentencing systems. This was kind of a surprise to us in a way. Also, and this is something that Julia Laskarensky will talk about more than me in her presentation, one of our major findings is that uncertainty about the length of individual sentences adds up in the aggregate to uncertainty about what your prison population size is going to be. So, indeterminacy on the level of individual cases can translate into increases and decreases ultimately in prison populations and a state's prison rate. Now, this project eventually will have two major reports in the next 3 or 4 or 6 months, a third report a year after that. It's also already generating 52 separate, what we call state reports. The District and Columbia and the federal system are also included. Jennifer Schaefer from the California Board of Parole Hearings, I think, might mention our California report in her remarks. But we have been working up on a report for every state, and they are posted on our website. We have about 14 of them posted already, and that number is just going to continue to grow in the coming months. Now, let me give you some idea about the diversity we see in different systems. One basic breakdown is what we call paroling states versus non-paroling states. A paroling state, in our definition, is a state that offers a parole release discretion, at least for a large percentage of its prisoners or sentences that to prisoners that are admitted into their system. So paroling states, at least there's a preponderance of a parole release discretion, and then non-paroling states may have some parole, but only a little bit. If it's not there for a substantial number of prisoners, we classify a state as a non-paroling state. And you see here on this map, the paroling states in yellow, the non-paroling states in green. Nationwide, there are 18 non-paroling jurisdictions. The rest are paroling. So let me give you some illustrations from paroling systems, how we think about it, how we work with our data. In Rhode Island, quite a few prisoners are admitted and with a maximum sentence. So this timeline is meant to sort of move from left to right, showing the amount of time that could be served on this sentence from 0% all the way up to 100%. In Rhode Island, at least in this example, we have parole release eligibility at the 33% mark of the sentence. So that is, unless there's some different rules apply, the judge's sentence will determine that the prisoner stays at least this long. And then from that point forward, the sort of the grayed out part of the timeline is meant to indicate that there is now parole discretion for that segment. And looking at the parole segment, we think about it in two ways. During that sort of indeterminate range of the sentence, the parole board has release discretion, so it has the discretion to release people earlier than their maximum term. But we also think of this in terms of release denial discretion, so that it's also discretion to keep people much longer than their minimum terms. So one insight that just has we have seen over and over in the project is that a lot of indeterminacy in a prison sentence doesn't necessarily mean leniency or lenity. It could go either way. It's always a two-edged sword. A very early eligibility for parole means some people could get out early, but some other prisoners could be made to stay much, much longer than those released earlier in the timeline. Now, for the Rhode Island example that I just gave with parole eligibility at the 33% mark, if the parole board refused to release until the maximum term had expired, you treat that as the longest sentence, time served would be 3 times the length of time served if the parole board chose to release the prisoner at first eligibility. So there's a ratio attached to that sentence of longest time served to shortest time served under that formula. And when we scale this up, when we go all the way up to prison population size, our additional insight is that if you just look at the prisoners who have that particular type of sentence as a group, over time, the decision patterns of the parole board, letting people out early versus late, has the potential to vary the prison population size of prisoners with that sentence. And the ratio there is the same as for an individual prisoner in terms of how much jurisdiction over time a parole board potentially has in making prison populations go up or down. It's the same 3-to-1 ratio. We call this the population multiplier potential. Julia will talk more about this. But it certainly presents a policy question that we all think about. what tools are available to policymakers or lawmakers to build in to sort of manage or give structure to these vast reservoirs of discretion in individual cases and on the sort of level of the entire system. So let me give you a few more examples from parole releasing states. The Rhode Island formula exists in several states. We actually have come across several states where there is no minimum term. Hawaii is one example, which means that on the date of admission, a new prisoner could be released by the parole board. And this applies to most prisoners in the Hawaii system. So there, the parole board has release discretion across the entire timeline. Sentences could be very, very short, or if you think in terms of release denial discretion, sentences for some people could be much longer. Pennsylvania, Colorado is another example. Some states delay parole release eligibility until, say, the 50% mark of the prison timeline. And there are certain types of sentences, often for violent offenders in paroling states, where a prisoner may have to wait until the 85% mark before the parole release discretion of the parole board kicks in. So this 85% on this drawing doesn't mean that the prisoner gets out at 85%. It's just that the parole board gets to decide at that point. Now, in contrast to the paroling systems, non-paroling systems operate much differently. A good example of a non-paroling system that we're very familiar with here in Minnesota is the Minnesota system. And the way things work in Minnesota for most prisoners is that the judicial sentence automatically comes with a presumptive, or it's going to actually be a mandatory release date at 2/3 of the prison term, unless the prisoner gets into some sort of serious trouble through disciplinary violations during the stay. So this mandatory release date that comes because of the prisoner's good conduct or avoidance of bad conduct is a mandatory date. So there's no more discretion beyond that date if the prisoner's behavior matches the standard. So this kind of arrow shows that the release has to be at the mandatory date. No one has release denial discretion past the mandatory date in the individual case. Now, across non-paroling systems, there are lots of different formulas. In the federal system, probably the most famous non-paroling system, if you get all your credits in general as a federal prisoner, your release date will be at 87% of your sentence. And again, there's no more discretion here. If you've gotten your credits, that's a mandatory date, but it comes very late in the very close to the judicial maximum term. Some non-paroling systems give the prisoners the possibility of earning mandatory release dates that are much earlier than that. In Illinois, we found quite a number of prisoners with credits, including good time and earned time, that could get their mandatory release all the way back to the 30% mark of the judicial sentence. And Jennifer probably knows this, at least for one small category of nonviolent offenders in California, if they get lots and lots of earned time credits through program participation, it's even possible they could get 80% off of their maximum term solely through credits. This is not at all dependent on parole. Now, in the life of the project, one thing that's really fascinated us that I don't think any of us had focused on beforehand is the fact that in some states there's sort of overlapping release mechanisms. There can be a lot of overlap between parole release discretion and release based on the accrual of credits. And let me give you some examples of what I mean by that. Iowa looks at the beginning like Hawaii because most prisoners come into the Iowa prison system with no minimum term, so they could be released right away within seconds of admission, at least according to the statutes, or they could be kept for the whole time. So that's a whole lot of discretion in the parole board. However, Iowa prisoners can earn pretty generous credits during their stay that are kind of standard in Iowa, basically on a good time model. If you get your credits in Iowa, your term is actually going to be reduced by 55% so that you have a mandatory release at the 45% mark. And what really strikes us about this model in Iowa is after the 45% mark, either the Department of Corrections through its decisions could cause a prisoner to be released, or the parole board through its unilateral discretion could cause a prisoner to be released. And neither agency needs the approval of the other agency. So there's sort of parallel unilateral discretions to release, and no one in that last 55% has release denial discretion. So we call this a checks and balances approach, where two agencies are actually at work in determining how long the prisoner is actually going to stay. Now, this model is especially important, we think, for prisoners who are convicted of violent offenses. And one of the earliest examples we came across was from Oklahoma, where most prisoners, including violent offenders, are technically eligible for parole at the 25% mark of their sentences. However, if you're convicted of a violent offense in Oklahoma, you're not going to get out on parole at the 25% mark, or probably not at any point during your sentence. The release rates for violent offenders in Oklahoma, for various reasons, are in the low single digits. So all they've got in terms of the parole board is release denial all the way up to the maximum term. However, even violent offenders in Oklahoma can earn fairly generous credits. And so we ran some calculations for one sort of hypothetical sentence for a violent offender in Oklahoma, that through accrual of good time credits, the offender could bring sentence length back, shave off 48% from the maximum term through credit. So again, the parole board technically has release discretion, but they're not exercising it. But there's a second form of release discretion that prison officials, Department of Corrections have, that can still move release dates fairly significantly back from the mandatory release of the maximum term. So we have a term for this. We call these movable MRDs, movable mandatory release dates, where the more credits you get, the earlier your mandatory release comes. And during that period where credits potentially will move your release date, the only way a prisoner would not get out is if the prisoner gets unfavorable rulings or decisions consistently from both the DOC and from the parole board. So again, this is kind of a checks and balances where no single agency is wholly in charge. Now, as I say, we've become very interested in these sort of credit-driven and mixed systems in our work, but it does raise a number of policy or implementation questions that we haven't been able to investigate deeply for each jurisdiction, but we see that they are there. If you're using mandatory release dates to shorten terms, then the questions come up, well, how are prison officials exercising the discretion? Does everyone get their credits? Are a lot of credits forfeited? Are they classifying prisoners in a way that they can earn credits, and so on? There's a lot that you would want to know about how the system actually operates. How hard is it to earn the credits that you need to get your earlier mandatory release date? In some states, you have to complete a whole bunch of programs. In some states, all you have to do is stay clean of disciplinary violations. But probably the most endemic problem that everyone is familiar with is the availability of programs. If the credits needed to get out earlier than the maximum depend on program participation or completion, what do you do if programs just aren't there? They're in short supply, maybe they don't exist at all in some prisons. What do you do to adjust your system if those are the realities? And we have some suggestions looking at that scenario. It's possible that low-risk prisoners could be screened out of most of the programming requirements if the programs aren't there. We could also think about softening credit earning requirements, often switching more to a good time model if you don't have program availability might be one option to consider. And as an ultimate fallback, there are some states that we've run across that actually waive credit earning requirements if they require a program or an educational opportunity that just isn't there for certain prisoners. And I'll just leave you with a couple examples of those that already exist. In New Jersey, there's a statute that says that, well, prisoners still going to get their credits if they have applied for a program. They tried to get in the program, but they're denied. They can't get in for reasons that are beyond the inmate's control. And those reasons include capacity limitations in program slots. So this is at least one state confronting the reality that if you're making release dependent on credit availability, you may need to think hard about what are we going to do when the programs aren't there. Another similar statute exists in North Carolina. I think these slides will be up on our website, but these are just many of the issues that come up once you get focused either on credit-driven systems or mixed systems that mix a great deal of parole release discretion with credit-based release. So I'm going to stop there. I hope it just gives you a feeling for the work that we have done, and I am going to turn it over to Jennifer Schaefer for her thoughts on this work.
Thank you so much. First, I want to say thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate the invitation. And I want to thank the Robina Institute and Arnold Ventures, for taking on such a meaningful and ambitious project, providing a detailed, comprehensive overview of the legal framework governing the release of incarcerated populations from all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the federal government, federal system is a remarkable achievement, especially in the short time frames that has been conducted. So I want to talk a little bit about why is this work so important? And specifically, I want to talk a little bit about how this project provides context for other large bodies of research upon which we rely, context for comparing outcomes between jurisdictions, and some future policy considerations that I think are raised by the work in the reports that have been published already and the draft reports that hopefully will soon be released. So first off, the context, how this work provides context for other large bodies of research upon which we rely. So I have to say, we're from a non-paroling state, according to the Robina Institute's analysis, which may come a little bit as a little bit of a shock to have me, the executive officer for the Board of Parole Hearings, the parole board, who we make discretionary parole decisions in California, and to have me speak about this project. It's not that California doesn't have discretionary parole. We just don't have discretionary parole for the majority of our prison population, but that is shifting. I'm not certain that that will be the same in a matter of a few years as a result of some processes that have been put in place already. So the comments I'm going to give today are from the perspective of the parole board. And as a parole board, it's our mission to make the most informed, evidence-based decisions possible. It's critical for us to do so. Every day we make really difficult decisions that impact public safety and a person's liberty interest. The question we ask in each of those decisions is, can we safely release this person into the community? In that space, we are profoundly impacting victims, the incarcerated population, their families, and our communities. We are very much stewards of the public's trust in that respect, and we take that responsibility very seriously. So how do we make these decisions? First off, we rely on the expertise of forensic psychologists, the wide body of research concerning risk of recidivism and desistance theory. We use a structured decision-making framework in California to guide our analysis, and we focus on issues of procedural fairness, and due process. So we gather and learn all this information, and we apply it to the best of our ability. And we incorporate it into our policies and our practices, which leads to the next obvious question. What is the outcome of these efforts? So obviously, one of the key components of informed decision-making is to study outcomes. It's imperative. It has been the subject of countless studies in jurisdictions around the world. And we look at those studies and those outcomes. And when we see another jurisdiction that has been particularly successful in one way or another, we ask ourselves, how did they do that? How did they safely release more people without compromising public safety? Or how did they release the same number of people while reducing recidivism? We have learned it's not enough to look at that outcome data alone. We must also consider the context in which those outcomes are achieved. It is here where historically there's been a lack of available and useful information. For example, we might ask if the releases are the result of increased credit earning. If so, what mechanisms were used? Was rehabilitation incentivized through programming credits or an earlier opportunity for discretionary parole? Or was it the use of good time credits that deterred negative behavior in prison? Or was it a combination of both? With respect to credit earning, what we have seen in California, is that while credit earning can be a very effective way to promote positive behavior and rehabilitation for the majority of the incarcerated population, it is not particularly impactful for the segment of our prison population serving sentences that exceed a natural lifespan. People serving sentences of 60, 80, 100 years or more. Now, California might be unique in that respect. I don't know the length of sentences or how long sentences can be that are enacted in other states or imposed in other states. But in California, we do have a segment of our population who were sentenced to exceedingly long sentences. So when we think about credit earning, I think it's important to also look at the total length of all sentences imposed, because obviously those credits are applied to everyone, with a few exceptions. So for persons sentenced to extremely long sentences, creating opportunities for discretionary parole are perhaps more likely to provide a more meaningful opportunity for release for that segment of the population, which is exactly what California has done over the last few years. So I think one of the most interesting aspects of the Robina Institute's project is the analysis of that intersection between credit earning and eligibility for discretionary parole and releases. I don't think there has been much analysis in that area of post-conviction policy. And we're living that in California right now. We have those intersections really for the first time in quite some, in the history of California, with some recent changes in our law. So we are eagerly awaiting the outcome of some of those laws that have been set in motion in California recently. And these reports help us look at other jurisdictions and how they're set up. And I'm hoping we'll be able to learn some best practices from how they've implemented similar structures where they have those intersections between credit earning and discretionary parole. So now I want to talk a little bit about the context for comparing outcomes. So the Robina Institute's research, I think, is also important because it does provide a very meaningful context for comparing outcomes between jurisdictions. And I'm going to give you just one example, again, from the perspective of a paroling authority. So for paroling authorities, we often speak in terms of grant rates and recidivism. In California, for example, our grant rate in 2020 was 36%. That means that 36% of parole hearings that we held that were conducted in 2020 resulted in a grant of parole. On the surface, that might seem high or it might seem low when compared to other jurisdictions. But it's not enough to simply compare numbers. So I'll give you an example. While that 36% grant rate in California might seem low when you're comparing it to a jurisdiction that conducts administrative reviews for persons convicted of low-level offenses. They might have a very high grant rate, a much higher grant rate. That differs significantly from California. In California, we're considering the release of persons serving very long sentences for serious and violent crimes, the majority of whom are serving life with the possibility of parole for first or second degree murder. I think most people would agree that the parole decisions at issue in those two jurisdictions are extremely different. This is especially true if the jurisdiction considering release of those lower level offenses is also a state where there's a minimum and a maximum term of incarceration established by statute. And the person's period of supervised release is controlled by their maximum term of incarceration imposed by the court. In other words, if the paroling authority retains that person in prison until they reach their maximum term, they'll be released with no supervision in the community. This adds a dynamic to discretionary parole decision-making that can actually incentivize earlier release in order to ensure that there's a period of supervised transition in the community. That dynamic doesn't exist in California, where parole terms are separate from the sentences imposed, separate and distinct from the sentences imposed by the court. So the reports generated by Robina Institute provide an in-depth analysis of that legal framework governing discretionary releases from prison, and it gives us a context for making meaningful comparisons between jurisdictions, which is a really difficult thing to do. And then another aspect of comparison that I think is a little beyond the scope of the Robina Institute's project is recidivism. So when we're looking at outcomes, as I said, we're looking at things like approval rates, grant rates, release rates, and we're looking at what is the impact of that, what recidivism has occurred as a result of those decisions. So I think that while it's really important to look at things like credit earning and discretionary for parole for mechanisms for reducing prison populations, I think it's equally as important to look at the outcomes of those decisions. And for instance, if there's a significant increase in releases, but there's also a corresponding increase in recidivism, many people would suggest that perhaps that wasn't the best route to go down. So I think it's a tricky thing to think about how can we safely release more people in a way that either maintains or lessens existing recidivism rates. So lastly, I want to talk a little bit about some policy implications for this work. So I've had the privilege of serving as executive officer for California's border parole hearings for the past 10 years. During that time, California has implemented a series of measures to address its once overcrowded prisons, some of which I have previously alluded to. Others I'll just briefly cover right now. One is California realigned its criminal justice system so that now only persons convicted of the most serious and violent crimes are sent to state prison. In another initiative, the voters amended our Constitution to give the Secretary of Corrections the sole authority to set credit earning for the state's prison population. That was really significant. And through a series of legislative measures and court orders, the opportunity for discretionary parole has been significantly expanded. In general, persons who are under the age of 26 when they committed their crime are eligible for parole once they serve 15, 20, or 25 years. Likewise, persons who are age 50 and who have served 20 years of incarceration are now eligible for parole consideration. Persons sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for crimes that they committed under the age of 18 are eligible for parole after 25 years. And from all of these persons who are condemned are excluded. And from youth offenders, from elderly parole, persons sentenced to life without the possibility of parole are also excluded. So trying to explain the impact of all of those significant changes on our prison population and explained the new avenues for discretionary release and credit earning opportunities has proven to be very difficult. It's very complex. And I really commend the Robina Institute for taking the time to really understand the legal framework that has impacted California's post-conviction criminal justice system so significantly. I think the outcome of those measures remains to be seen. We are starting to see some trends come out of it, and thankfully, recidivism rates have remained low, and it has been a significant shift in how we manage our correctional system in California. The report that's on the Robina website is incredibly detailed, and it really lays out all of the changes that have occurred in California and how complex our system is. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes now on some closing thoughts. So in reading the California report and the draft of the final report for phase 1 of this project, I was struck with a few overarching thoughts. First, again, it is an outstanding overview of what we have always thought to be true, that every state is unique, that it is hard to make sweeping generalizations from one jurisdiction to another. That said, there's much to learn from looking at the many examples of how our respective jurisdictions are structured. My hope is that these reports are only the beginning. Looking at release mechanisms through the lens of procedural fairness is equally important. For example, what impact do significant variations between sentences imposed and the actual time served have? What impact do those changes have on our judicial system as a whole? If greater degrees of indeterminacy are seen as positive, how do we convey that in a way that provides everyone in the criminal justice system with accurate information on the front end, so that everyone knows what to expect concerning credit earning and the possibility of parole consideration on the back end? We need to figure out better ways to provide more information in more transparent ways so that expectations are reasonable post-sentencing. I think we need to figure out a way for people to understand post-conviction processes, the credit earning and the opportunities for discretionary parole, as well as they understand pre-conviction processes. I don't think there's anybody who hasn't seen a crime show that talks about, your Miranda rights and arrests and the trial and the convictions. There's very few that cover what happens post-conviction. And I think I don't think that's good. I think people need to have realistic expectations for what happens post-sentencing. I think we owe that to victims, incarcerated populations, their families, and our communities. And I think until recently, it is a relatively obscure area of criminal justice. I think this project is a remarkable first step in bringing this aspect of our criminal justice system into the light. So thank you again for Robina Institute for doing the hard work and the heavy lifting and the very specific project analyses that you've done for the states. I look forward to reading the other states that aren't published yet. And thank you very much for having me here today. I look forward to answering any questions if there's time left at the end. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Kevin and Jennifer. And folks, just a reminder, if you want to submit questions, go ahead and use the Q&A. And then just to reiterate, we do currently have reports, state-by-state reports on this work on our website. We'll send those links out again with the, after this project, we'll be posting the recording online. We'll make sure that you all know how to access those things. And then a sort of overarching report, we'll sort of bring it all together and cover all of the states together. And that's what will be coming out in the next few months. So right now you can look at individual states, and eventually down the road a little bit, we'll have the overarching report. So Kevin and Jennifer talked about the more research side of this project, the legal framework research side of this project. I'm going to turn it over to Julia Laskarensky and Kristen Hilke now, and they're going to talk about a bit more of an applied approach, taking these concepts and applying them to a specific jurisdiction. So Julia, I'll hand it to you now. Then you'll just need to unmute. There you go.
So hopefully everybody can see my slides. So
We can
Thank you,
see them,
Kelly.
they're just not running yet. There you
Oh.
go. There you go. Perfect.
All right. So Kevin really brought me into this project to develop phase 2 of this research. And this has been really fun for me, fun in like a nerdy way, because what we did is we took the concepts that Kevin and his team have developed, more theoretical concepts, and we got to apply them to the real world, essentially, using, and today we'll talk about 2 studies in which we do that. Before we start, I do want to just quickly say that I want to give the bulk of the credit for this work to my colleague Jerry Gaze. He was really the one that wrangled both of these data sets and got the methodology in both of these studies to a very high level of rigor. So I want to thank him. And so we're going to look at 2 studies today. The first one, we ask essentially how much can parole board members and prison officials alter the size of the prison population through discretionary choices. And in that study, we use a restricted data set from the Bureau of Justice Statistics from the National Corrections Reporting Program. And that data set has individual prison admissions, releases, end of year stock records for every contributing state. I'll also talk about another study where we get even more micro level, where we look at how discretion operates in one specific jurisdiction, and that is Colorado. So hopefully at this point, you've been convinced that the power of back-end officials to alter time served is immense and should be paid attention to. Excuse me. And so in indeterminate sentencing states, you have the power of paroling authorities to have discretionary release decisions since a shortened and lengthened time served. And even in indeterminate sentencing states, you have prison officials, DOC officials, who can award or take away good time. And we've modeled kind of building on Kevin's concepts, we've modeled a way to demonstrate the potential choices there. So essentially, we've modeled the shortest and a longest time served scenario. And that's really meant to demonstrate the potential range of choices available to prison and parole release officials when they make their decisions. How we define the shortest time served scenario is when somebody is essentially released at their first eligibility, whether that's their first eligibility for parole release or in more determinate states, just when their first eligibility for release is. And then we also have the longest time served scenario. So in this scenario, prison and parole officials tend to be less generous. And so somebody who entered the prison system would not be awarded any of their good time, and the parole board would essentially deny the release until their max judicial sentence. And we model these relative to the current status quo. And the current status quo is the current proportion of the sentence served for each of the different states. And we do models for each of the states building on the individual state reports that Kevin and his team have put together. And so each state has a different starting point. Each state has a different potential that they can increase and decrease their prison population levels. So just to kind of put this into more specific numbers, if you have a prison sentence of 2 to 10 years, somebody might be eligible for parole release at the 2-year mark, but with good time, they could get out as early as 1.5 years. And so if you take a state that has on average, if somebody serves about 40% of their sentence, an individual in that state would get out after about 4 years. But if if back-end officials move towards a shortest time served scenario, that person could leave as early as 1.5 years, and the prison population would decrease with that same proportion. On the other end of the scale, moving towards a longest time served scenario, that person could serve as long as 10 years. And so if you did that over the entire prison population, you would increase the prison population by that amount. And so what we did is we disaggregated the states by determinate, indeterminate, and a few what we think of as mixed sentencing states. And so depending whether time served moves towards the shortest time served scenario or the longest time served scenario, the prison population will decrease or increase proportionally from the current levels of time served. And so since we're going to be talking about Colorado, I'll just point out here that Colorado has the potential to decrease their prison population by about 33% and has the potential to increase their prison population by about 36%, just through back-end discretionary choices, just through changes through back-end discretion. And to put some actual numbers to this, the current population, the prison population in Colorado is about 15,500. They could potentially get it up to over 20,000, and they could potentially get it down to below 10,000. So these are pretty big changes. The potential is there, right? And so you see here, Colorado's kind of towards the bottom here, and I'll just point out that the scales here aren't equal, but you know, you have a state like Michigan who's way high up here, who's particularly determined, it has particularly long prison sentences, and they have the potential to increase their population by 300%. So here what we've done is we've made the scales comparable. And so what you can see here are two main findings. States with indeterminate systems have a much greater potential for both prison population increase and decrease. And that really gets at the immense power of paroling authorities in those states. And then all states, regardless of system design, have a significantly smaller capacity at almost a 1-to-5 ratio to decrease their prison populations rather than increase it. Particularly determinate sentencing states, right over here, have very small capacity to decrease the prison population. It's about 4% on average. So there's just not a lot of movement downwards. There's not a lot of potential for movement downwards. And so what this means generally is that current practices, the current status quo is actually closer to the shortest time served scenario. And this is a work in progress. We currently have about 18 states. We're going to continue to add as Kevin and his team publish the individual state reports, because we do need those to model the structures in those states. So we'll be releasing this study early next year. So we did a second study, and this is specifically looking at how essentially how back-end powers of prison release discretion interact to govern the length of prison stays in Colorado. As you might remember, as I may have mentioned, but Colorado has, Kevin and his team consider Colorado a state that has moderate indeterminacy. And essentially what that means is that the Board of Parole and the Department of Corrections are given just somewhat more discretion over the total time served than the front-end judicial authorities who set prison sentences. And they have an almost equal ability to increase or decrease their prison population, right? So they could go either way. They also have two general classes of offense classes that are serving prison sentences that we're going to focus on today. They have a couple others that we're going to just ignore from now because they're smaller. They have a general offense class, which makes up the bulk of their prison population, and their parole eligibility date is about 50% of the maximum judicial sentence. They also have what we call the violent offense class, and this is for individuals who have been convicted of repeat violent offenses. They make up a smaller portion of the prison population, and their parole eligibility date is about 75% of their maximum sentence. And over time, earned time can reduce those minimums even further. And our main outcome measure for this study is the number of days spent in prison after the initial parole eligibility date. So the difference in days between the actual release date and the initial parole eligibility date. We really chose this outcome as opposed to just like the parole release rate, because it really gets at the power of both the parole board and the DOC in affecting prison term length. And so a larger number means that the parole board and the DOC is less generous in their release decisions, and a smaller number means that they're being more generous because they're releasing, people are being released closer to their parole eligibility date. And so we ran regression analysis on this main outcome variable for both classes of offenses, and I'm showing you the outcomes of that now using predictive margins. But so essentially, we ran a series of regressions, and we do have a long list of covariates, which I'm not going to go over today, but we do control for demographics and case control characteristics and things like that. But what we find overall is that from 1995 to about 2006, the release decisions essentially became less and less generous for both offense classes, in that and from about 2006 on to about 2020, release decisions became more and more generous for both offense classes. So people were being let out closer to their initial parole eligibility date. Just to put some numbers to this, within the general offense class, in 2006, people served on average about a year past their parole eligibility date. And then in 2020, people are now serving about 150 days past their parole eligibility date. So that's a pretty big difference. From about 2012 to 2020, we were able to add in even a larger amount of covariates, just a richer set, using risk assessment scores, prison misconduct records. And so when we added those in, we still saw the same pattern. And so we're pretty certain that this pattern is due to changes in how the parole board uses their discretion and not due to changes in the makeup of the parole eligible population. And while this research isn't causal, this pattern does mirror the prison rate change in Colorado during that exact same time, where it kind of peaked around 2006, 2007, and then decreased from there. I think we can assume that, as the parole board moved from the shortest time served scenario to from a longest time served scenario to a shorter time served scenario, that contributed to the decrease in the prison rate. We also wanted to examine for both classes, how offense seriousness has an effect on parole release decisions. And so we found that for both classes of offenses, individuals with more serious offenses spent a longer time in prison after their parole eligibility date. And I'm just showing you the graph for the general offense class. And this is true net of controls for risk, misconduct, demographics. And again, for the 2012 to 2020 sample, we have a very rich set of covariates for that. So, so we can be pretty sure that the parole board is denying release due to the seriousness of the crime and not necessarily due to the individual's risk factors or prison misconduct records or anything like that. And this is certainly one of the questions that I'm going to be asking Chair Hilke. So just to give you some numbers to this, again, for the lowest offense seriousness category, somebody might serve on average about 150 days after their initial parole eligibility date. And then at the highest end of the offense seriousness category level, they'll serve about 375 days. So we also want to study loss of good time, because that is, that's something that has not gotten enough attention. And I think, we wanted to see how often people lose good time and how that affects their final term length. In Colorado, serious misconduct can result in a loss of good time. And we did find that for individuals who had a serious misconduct, it added about 44 days to their release past their parole eligibility date. However, we found that less than 3% of the sample had a serious misconduct, and actually only about 5 or 6% of the sample had a less serious misconduct. So what we can gather from this is the DOC is not really using this power all too often, and it's probably not making a huge difference in the prison term length or the prison population size in Colorado. I just want to touch upon very quickly some policy implications. What this research really shows is that there are enormous variations in how each state's justice system structures prison release discretion, and how that discretion functions within each structure. And so, we don't have a criminal justice system in the United States. We have 50 separate criminal justice systems, plus the federal system, plus Washington, D.C. And so I think, we really, we can't adopt a cookie cutter approach to criminal justice reform. Really just want to also just underscore how much more research we need within each state to figure out what would work best based on the individual unique structures of that state. I also just want to touch upon the point of discretion. I think in criminological literature, discretion tends to be a bad word. We tend to write about it as a negative thing that causes disparities. That's not objective. And certainly that is an issue, but we should also talk about how to encourage what you would call good discretion. How would you encourage parole boards to safely release individuals when they can? What policies and practices can we put forward that can make that happen? So hopefully today we've convinced you that while the focus has been on the front end of the system to reduce prison populations, we could also focus on the back end of the system, and this has immense potential to also reduce prison populations. Again, I'll just underscore we need a lot more research. So I hope we've gotten people interested in working with us and alongside us to continue some of this research. One of the goals of this project was to work closely with paroling agencies, and we've got to do that with Colorado. So what we're going to do right now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. What I want to do right now is really ask Chair Hilke a little bit about the research that we've put together, and also generally about how the parole board makes decisions. I don't think we get to hear enough from practitioners about how they do their jobs. And I think that's really, it does a disservice to our research. And so I'm really happy that we got to put together this presentation and facilitate this conversation. So I will, so Chair Hilke is the chair of the Colorado Parole Board. She just got reappointed for another 3 years. And I'll start with the first question here. So in our research, we find that serious misconduct and even less serious misconduct is rare in the sample, meaning that very few people lose their good time credit due to misconduct. Do you find this surprising? And in general, what role do you think good time policies play in prison release in Colorado?
Thank you so much, Julia. And I just want to echo what Jennifer Schaefer said. I am so appreciative of the Robina Institute and the work of Julia Kevin, as well as Jerry. And then I also want to acknowledge my own team back home here in Colorado. Annie Andrews, our statistician, that was quite active, and this Robina dive into Colorado, as Tammy Murphy, who runs the office. And then, of course, my vice chair, Chad Dilworth. So having said that, thank you for letting me be here. First and foremost, I want to say that I spent 10 years in a jail prior to coming to the parole board, and I look forward to talking more about just the education of the people that sit on the board now. But there are 18 state prisons and 2 private prisons in Colorado. And so Julia was talking earlier about how it's so complex, but even when you get down to a state jurisdiction, there is complexity at that level with 18 different prisons, 2 of them being private. Having said that, I think there's a multitude of factors. I think my experience, and this doesn't surprise me, that earned time is used pretty liberally, and that I worked in a jail, and one of the things that the jail administrators focused on is obviously how can we transition the population out as new people come in and manage the population. And that was the use of good time. And we would use all the good time. So I think you're going to find in Colorado, the majority of the states, the majority of the jails grant the full amount of good time that can be earned regardless of the behavior of the inmate. Now, certainly there may be a small percentage that is penalized, but nonetheless, similar to Colorado prison system, DOC uses all of the earned time for 97% of the population. So you talked about how DOC and their discretionary power could have an influence on the population, but how DOC is currently operating in Colorado is the only thing that DOC would do if they started to use their discretion is increase the number of people that remain in prison, because right now we're already granting the entire amount. So having said that, I'm not surprised that we provide as much earned time, good time in the state of Colorado. And I think that having gone through this research with you, 3% of the population of Colorado, and right now we're around 17,000, only 3% of that population is penalized and must stay in custody longer based on DOC's discretion versus the parole board.
Thank you for that. And I also just want to mention that we just have so little data on this. This is really, we were able to find very few other instances of studies that had rates of good time accrual or good time withdrawal. So we appreciate the fact that you're able to contribute to this. So one of our other main findings was about the importance of offense seriousness to parole release decisions, in that people who have more serious offenses also spend a longer amount of time past their parole eligibility date. Is this in line with your understanding of how the parole board makes decisions, and how does the consideration of offense seriousness play out in these decisions?
Sure, Colorado does have statutorily we're required to look at a number of things. The totality of the circumstances, the seriousness of the offense. And so when you look at the more violent offenders, it shouldn't surprise many that they spend a longer period of time past their parole eligibility date, for the sheer fact of the seriousness of the offense, and that we know that seriousness doesn't necessarily correlate to risk of recidivating or their risk of reoffending. However, it's really hard to wrap your brain around a violent offense and letting somebody else out as much as like a murder. You're really going to look at that, and all honesty, many people that have very, very violent offenses, such as murders, have the lowest risk on assessments and actually do the best on parole. And so it is interesting that despite the fact that they continue to stay in custody for a longer period of time, the reality is that they're a population that is much easier to supervise and much more successful. The other thing that you have to think about is the amount of harm that the crime has had on the community. And that does not go unnoticed. You kind of have to weigh the risk and the readiness against the impact that that crime had on the individual or individuals, their family and loved ones, as well as the community and the state as a whole. And so people with violent offenses staying in custody longer shouldn't be a surprise, because again, the risk and readiness factor is against the seriousness of the offense, whereas low non-violent offenses, you may not weigh that risk factor with the offense. And so as a result, I think what happens is in parole boards' minds, because of the immense harm to the community, those that committed violent offenses are likely going to spend a longer time in prison in Colorado.
Thank you for that. So we find that the parole board's decision-making became consistently less generous up until about 2006, and that it becomes more and more generous every year since. One of the limitations of this research is we don't know why. And from our conversations, it's not really fair to ask you why, because you may also not know why this has happened. But if you could just talk broadly about the changes you've seen in the parole board's decision-making over the last 15 years. And is there anything in your mind that could have contributed to these more generous release decisions in the last 15 years?
Yeah, like you said, Julia, there's probably a multitude of things that are certainly causing that. I will tell you, the war on drugs in the 80s and 90s put a lot of people in prison for an extended period of time. And so as you looked at the prison population in this country, it has done nothing but increase. And so I think philosophically, in the earlier part, you said from 2006, there's still residual impact from the laws that existed that were tougher on crime that then started to loosen up. Kind of parallel to that, the criminal justice system finally started to get really interested in risk assessments and what those are telling us, and that the actuality is a risk assessment is much more valid and where you should lean towards versus your own gut. And so criminal justice system used to use our guts all the time. You know, I've been in the system since 94, and it was always about your gut. You never really knew scientifically, if you will, about risk assessments. And I think that there was a broadened interest of the criminal justice system, and we started to professionalize the criminal justice system. And I think that's one of the reasons why you have seen an increase in decisions being much more thoughtful and much more science-driven, based on assessment, based on risk. And so by following best practices, a parole board is only going to become more and more effective. And statutorily, things change. And so obviously, as boards change, the philosophy of the board is going to evolve as well. Let's take one step back. In the philosophy of the governors are very different at times. And so I can tell you from my tenure, I was appointed by Governor John Hickenlooper He wants to professionalize the board. He believed very strongly that the parole board in Colorado should have criminal justice professionals that sit on it. And despite the fact that it is an appointed position, the governor's office sought people that had a lot of knowledge and experience in the criminal justice system. Governor Polis picked up that same philosophy, or had that same philosophy, and continued to just professionalize the parole board in Colorado. And I will tell you that we have over 225 years collectively of experience in the criminal justice system on the Colorado State Board of Parole, 9 members, 225 years of experience. I think that says that we have gotten more professional, more educated, and more experienced about following risk assessments. And rather than going with our gut, we have to go with what risk assessments are saying.
Thank you. I think, this is just a really interesting point because as we all know, sometimes risk assessments, oftentimes risk assessments get a bad rep, and you're essentially saying that the use of this tool has allowed you to make better and more effective decisions. So
it's certainly given us a starting point, but then, you have to, the human element is there then to weigh out all of the things that are maybe difficult, such as the seriousness or violence, violent offenses. So
we'll just do maybe 1 or 2 more questions, but I know you have you've talked about 2 new parole release policies that have been adopted in Colorado. Changes to special needs parole and an early review of certain juvenile cases. I know other states, I'm sure, would love to hear what you're doing. And this is an example of, structuring back-end release practices to make them, to encourage, effective release that's in line with with the goals of this project. So could you talk a little bit more about those 2 policies and the purpose of them, and do you see them being successful?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll talk about the Juveniles Convicted as Adults program. It goes by JCAP. We use lots of acronyms in the criminal justice system, but the legislator passed this law in 2017 and basically directed the Department of Corrections to create a 3-year intense program that addressed criminal risk, mental health, substance abuse, cognitive thinking, those areas, as well as vocational, getting a GED if they don't have a high school education, as well as improving in vocational and a variety of vocational areas the Department of Corrections has certifications in. And so the Juvenile Convicted as Adult program is a 3-year program that is very intense, is assigned a social worker, assigned a clinician that follows that individual throughout the 3 years. And that individual does a lot of self-work, as well as learning trades that could potentially make them more successful out in the community. And so individuals that committed a felony offense before they were the age of 21, and it was filed as an adult, they were charged as an adult, have the opportunity after they spend 20 to 30 years of their sentence, they can then apply to get into the JCAP program. They have to apply and be accepted into the program. And then after completing the 3-year program, they will have a parole application hearing with a parole board member, and then the entire board will make a determination as to whether or not to support an early release of that individual. And we make a recommendation to the governor as to whether or not the board in its totality would make a recommendation to release that person on early parole. We've had 8 people be released under this program. It started it, or the legislators did it in 2017. DOC had to have the program up and running. And by 2020, people were graduating. And so the first 8 individuals that graduated have been granted early parole as a result of that program, where the likelihood of them getting out never would have been a possibility to them. So it has given that population hope. And I think that that's really important to remember, is we always have to give people hope, even when they are in very difficult situations such as prison. The other thing you talked about, Julia, was special needs parole. And what special needs parole is complex because there's a variety of different people that are eligible at certain times for certain things. And so any individual that's over the age of 55 and has been diagnosed with they're suffering from a chronic infirmity type illness, the condition or the disease, or a mental health or behavioral health disorder that causes serious impairment and limits that person's ability to function, that person, based on the recommendation from a clinician, could come before the board and be recommended for special needs parole, meaning that they can be released onto parole early, prior to them hitting their parole eligibility date, as well as after hitting their parole eligibility date. And that may be looking at the criminal aspect is different, but now there's a medical component that certainly can be taken into consideration about what that person's risk. In addition to that, 64 years of age and older, they have to have served at least 20 years of a person's sentence. They cannot have been convicted of a Class 1 or a Class 2 felony or any unlawful sexual behavior. So outside of that, anybody that's 64 years and older, if they have a serious medical condition that's creating impairment, a clinician can submit that person for for special needs parole. Again, it's all determined by a licensed healthcare provider, and we certainly will bring in the Department of Human Services to evaluate somebody's competency, and potentially that person could be released through special needs parole. So both medical and mental health we look at, and the clinicians drive the bus in terms of who's appropriate to come based on the statutory requirements that each kind of bucket has to take.
Right. Chair Hilke, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you so much for answering our questions. I think we have just about 10 minutes for a little bit of Q&A. So I'll turn it over to Kelly.
Yes, thanks everyone. This has been a really great session, and we have a couple of questions that I thought we could kind of go through. I think the first one is really something that would be aimed either at Jennifer Schaefer or Kristen Hilke. Earlier, Julia showed the graph where in Colorado, people who had those more serious offenses were serving longer periods past their initial eligibility date. So the question is, the person who submits a question says, serious offenses will get longer sentences, so it doesn't make sense that they shouldn't have to wait for parole, or so doesn't it make sense that they shouldn't have to wait for parole? Or does the parole board see their role as adding punishment time to those convicted of more serious offenses? It's kind of what's a little bit of that decision-making process there.
Yeah, I think I spoke a little bit of that earlier, in that you do have to look at the totality of the circumstances, and you do have to look at the seriousness of the offense. And the victim impact and the community impact that a crime has had. And so I think that's a really good point in regards to what the person that asked that question is, that you are right. People that have serious offenses typically have a longer prison sentence. So it's not the parole board's job to determine how long somebody stays in custody. It's the parole board's job to weigh risk and readiness. And sometimes people that have been in prison for an extended period of time need more assistance in transitioning out of prison And so potentially they could be granted some kind of transitional program, such as community corrections, to have them transition. So I get what the person is asking. I certainly understand it, but I think you have to look at all of the statutory requirements, and you have to look at the risk and readiness. Readiness is what I'm talking about. A low risk person may not be high ready and may not be a good candidate to parole as a result of that.
I can probably add, I can give you a little bit of a different perspective, similar, but a little different from California. We see somebody's minimum, once they've reached their parole eligible date, from our perspective, the time that they've served getting up to that date is the punishment or the whatever portion of their sentence that was mandated. Once they come to us, our sole responsibility is for determining whether that person poses a current unreasonable risk to public safety. So it is a presumption that the person will be granted parole, and there's no difference between the first time they come to the board or if they're denied and come subsequently. We've actually seen a really significant increase in the percentage of our grants that are being, not only have we seen a significant increase in the number of people coming to the board for the first time, because of the changes in the laws, but we've also seen a similar increase in the percentage of grants that are awarded at initial hearings. So I think one of the things that Chair Hickey was speaking about was the power of hope. And I think in California, 2 decades ago, it was incredibly rare, if not virtually impossible, for a life term, somebody serving a life term sentence to be granted parole. And that has changed. I think when I first came to this job, I could go into a prison, and if I asked our persons serving life term sentences if they've ever known anybody who had gone home, who had been granted and been released, the answer was no. Now, I don't think there's a single person serving a life with the possibility of parole sentence in a state prison today who doesn't know somebody who's gone home. And so I think what we have seen is the combination of the reality, the fact that that's a real opportunity for people now, has motivated people to become more ready for parole, similar to what Colorado has experienced or part of their decision making. And the law just governs that we don't have different standards depending on the time that they come before the board.
Thanks. So, earlier Jennifer gave us a really lovely description of what she sees as the impact of this work on her, on the effect that it can have for her as a practitioner in the field, someone who's actively using these things. Kevin, I want to go back to you and ask, what were you hoping to achieve? Is sort of what Jennifer told us about, does that match up with what you were hoping that this research would achieve, or where do you want to go with it?
Well, no, I think, I'm delighted that, Jennifer and Kristen find this work useful to them. And that's what we were really hoping, at least in my part of the project, was to provide some just basic structural information about all the different ways that states do things, with the hope that, well, in particular states, it would help them kind of get a different sort of perspective on what they're doing. But then it would be very easy to look at diagrams or look at reports and see how other states were functioning. And it's an area in this country where there's so much diversity of approach just in the law, how these systems are built, that it just kind of makes your head spin. You just wonder, the people who created the laws across the country, they couldn't possibly all be thinking about the same things. There's got to be a variety of rationales and practical realities that come to bear. But until you see the differences across jurisdictions, you can't even ask those questions. And you can't pose a question within your jurisdiction if you turn out to be an outlier and no one else is doing what you're doing. You may not even be aware of that. So I think we were trying to give people that level of insight. And then, at least in my mind, we really had no idea what they would do with it, because everyone knows things that we don't know about their systems or other systems. And there's this sort of wealth of experience and knowledge out there that is hard to anticipate. So I really see, part of this project is just hopefully developing a lot by the work of other people and developing in ways that I could not have imagined ahead of time. And I think providing the sort of framework that we're providing kind of opens the door for that possibility.
All right, well, we are 1 minute out. And so I want to take the opportunity to thank everybody for attending this webinar today. I want to thank our presenters, Kevin Reitz, Jennifer Schaefer, Julia Laskarensky, and Kristen Hilke. It's been a really great blend of theory and application. It's been really exciting to me to see this whole project come together. For those of you who attended today, we will definitely be posting this webinar on our website, so you'll be able to share it with your friends. And we hope you will also be coming to our website to review the reports, and we will definitely be announcing the overarching report as soon as it's ready for release. So thank you everyone for attending today, and have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.